think it just helps to have like a very ambitious roadmap. One thing that strikes me every time I talk to people who are building product in conjunction with the research teams at the labs, or even some of our companies that have like agentic workflow products out in the wilds, like Harvey, is they just assume that they're going to be able to do like everything eventually. And if you do that, the current set of products that you have will always fall short, like really far short. But you can take this broad set of things that you want to be able to do with agents and just say, like, how do I close that gap? And like, where are capabilities allowing me in combination with a bunch of sort of new orchestration techniques and tool use going to get me closer to accomplishing that action? So I think it helps to have a very ambitious North Star.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Deployed. I'm excited to have Sarah Guo on the podcast today. She's a founding partner at Conviction, made early investments in generative AI companies like Sierra and Harvey and Mistral and Base 10. We were fortunate to have her as an early investor in FreePlay. And it's always fun talking to Sarah because she spends a good chunk of her time talking with people that are absolutely on the cutting edge of what's happening with AI, including inside the big labs like OpenAI and Anthropic. And then also gets to spend a lot of time advising some of the big enterprises that are trying to figure out what are they doing with AI. And so in this call today, we get into topics that are relevant to builders, I think, across that spectrum, whether you're a big company or a small one. But we get into things like the speed of evolution in this space and best practices or techniques she's seen people follow for how to keep up, some of the cultural traits that she sees across like what a successful team looks like, some advice for would-be founders on where to focus toward the end. Overall, it's a great conversation, especially if you've been, maybe focused on execution and want to pull up a little bit and reflect about whether you're focusing on the right things with your AI projects. So hope you enjoy it. With that, we'll jump in. Thanks so much. All right, everybody, welcome Sarah to the show. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. And just for folks who don't know you, I'm going to ask you to start by doing a quick intro. Tell us who you are, why we're having the conversation today. I'd love to hear a little bit more about Conviction and what you're up to.
Yep. So thanks for having me. Conviction is a startup itself. So it's a 2.5-year-old venture firm. We are focused very simply on early stage AI. So doing full stack investing in companies that are doing training, building applications, building infrastructure, and with the basic premise being this is the biggest change that's happened in technology in a really long time. Will create a lot of really new opportunities. So small group based in the San Francisco area today. And me and my partner, Mike, previously worked at larger generalist venture firms.
Yep. That's awesome. And you've been at it now for a couple of years. I know like we met relatively early on in that journey, but I think you were ahead of a lot of your peers in seeing this coming. Like, I'm just curious for folks that are listening, like get a little bit more context in your background. How did you get exposed to like what was happening with AI initially? And then what led you to say like, hey, we should go all in on this and make it the focus of the fund?
So people have been doing machine learning in production use cases in ways that mattered for the product or economically, be it at Twitter or other places for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And so at my prior firm, Greylock, we were investors in companies like Facebook that might use machine learning for ad targeting, for example. And so I think it became true. It became like just clearly true across a series of Greylock companies that you could use, earlier forms of intelligent computing to make the product better or more efficient in some way. And I think there was a piece of it that was also just like the technical curiosity piece. Like one thing that I've always loved about being an early stage investor is your job is to hang out with the best technical people and figure out what is possible from a product perspective and an engineering perspective. And so I knew a bunch of people who were working on research early in sort of the next generation of AI. One of those people was Andrew Ng. He was one of the very early people in deep learning. And so I suppose I spent time around people who convinced me that that it was going to be increasingly important. And then that was true in a series of different application companies, different use cases, everything from uh, marketplaces to email security, right? And started investing in these sorts of companies while I was at Greylock. I still sit on the board of a company called Base 10, for example. Um, we made this investment like 5 years ago now, and is really in the last 2 years that people wanted a lot of inference, right?
Yeah,
Or
for sure.
deployment, some more optimization, and just the ramifications of this becoming a huge part of how people build applications just became way more obvious in the last few years. And so I'd say I think the other piece, besides just being curious about the algorithms and the scale up of those, was that um, there's like a question on UX of all of this. And so a guy named Mustafa Suleiman, who was one of the co-founders of DeepMind, then started a company called Inflection. He's now at Microsoft. He and Karen and Reid Hoffman started a company called Inflection. And Mustafa is a friend and was a strong proponent of natural language interfaces and the idea of like, the productivity assistant, the companion assistant. And so I think between him and some researchers and the prior generation of like looking at like early voice and messaging interfaces and saying like, oh, it'd be really cool if that actually worked. Those conversations were incredibly hard to model and create good experiences with the prior generation of technology.
Yep.
But I think the idea on the product side stuck in my head and just became closer. And so, about 10 years into Greylock, I had a lot of confidence that it was the biggest thing that I would see in my career. I was kind of, you know, I joined the technology world like partway into the SaaS revolution after the internet revolution had really happened, or we were on like second or third gen of that set of applications, and it was just too big of an opportunity to not go after. And I think I also just wanted to start something again.
No, that's awesome. And yeah, we were both working on chatbots in that like 1.0 era, 2015 and 2016, and saw it all not working. Do you like, so, I mean, I think we lived the same thing. When I was at Twitter, we saw the power of like just recommender systems and what it did in the timeline. It was the biggest metric mover for the company by far, that and notifications. And like these consumer companies had these huge piles of data. Um, they were able to leverage it, create awesome things from it. Like one of the things that got me excited first about LLMs was that suddenly there were ways to make use of ML technology with far less data. And now all these other companies had access to it. Like what you were doing with Conviction, was it just kind of coincidentally around the start of LLMs becoming popular, like the launch of ChatGPT? Did you see what was coming with generative AI, or was it like kind of right place, right time?
Well, I think we absolutely got lucky in that. I mean, just being born at this period of time and being in Silicon Valley, I'd say is like right place, right time, right?
For sure.
Here, I mean, I was giving presentations about like why transformers were interesting in 2018, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the idea that you would have pre-trained models that were increasingly useful, and the idea that diffusion was going to be better and better, like both those architectural concepts, they were like actually well known within like a really small group of technologists. They just weren't. It just wasn't nearly as obvious for a few years. Um, and so I mean, we launched before ChatGPT, and I think that one of the things that happened that was really important is that um, every business leader of a certain scale on the planet at some point saw ChatGPT and said, "Wow, that's really new," and I can
Yep.
imagine that will do something to my business, or that I could use a technology like that if it generalizes, if it applies in all these different ways. And so I think there's a piece that is the technology existing and getting better. I think there's also a piece of like creating openness from like the end users of the low key research preview. So we all have OpenAI to thank for that.
I mean, maybe to that end, like, part of what's been interesting getting to know you and talking with you is like you get to spend a lot of time with people that are on the very front edge of this ecosystem at the labs, at interesting companies, startup founders that are leading in this space are coming to you and saying, hey, check out what I'm doing. For a lot of people listening to this podcast, I think that they're often like in an established company, their heads down, they're building. Sometime in the last couple of years, like they've been catching up and starting to build with generative AI. There are different stages in that journey. I think it'd be really just like probably interesting to a lot of listeners to hear about like what you're seeing on the front edge today. For everybody else, it's just like heads down in their work. And we had a little bit of conversation earlier, both about like, what do you see happening within the labs? What do you see happening within like the application side? But wondering like what's top of mind for you right now as like the cutting edge, but like important stuff that folks in each of those groups are talking about that might be relevant to other builders in this space and they might want to, be paying attention to.
I think like there's this huge positive of like rapidly increasing capability in the models themselves, in quality of the sort of tooling and ecosystem that enables one to build useful applications.
Yep.
I think that's offset actually by a challenge for everyone right now, which is like the ways in which you should manipulate the model to use your information to successfully do more and more sophisticated tasks is changing like every month.
Yeah.
Right. And so like you and I were talking about how within a sort of select group of people working in very sophisticated organizations doing tasks that are still out of distribution for the core models, reinforcement fine tuning is incredibly data efficient, and you can get these models to do really impressive agentic, like long running tasks with effort and specialized data collection. I think that keeping up with the sequence of like, okay, what is the state of the art way to do RAG today? How should I orchestrate agents with like error handling that doesn't compound? What is the right way to implement guardrails? What are the tasks that are in distribution versus out of distribution? And like those are month to month decisions. And so I don't know that anything that I say here is going to be out of date in
Stale
like
quickly.
in the week that it takes to actually release the conversation. But I think the overarching theme is like nobody was talking about reasoning a year ago,
For sure.
18 months ago at least. Right. And so I do think that like the skill within organizations that is very useful is like being up to date on the latest and greatest from a techniques perspective. And then like that, I think a lot of that is actually primary learning of like understanding your own business and what the models are capable of. Going back to what you asked about if we actually had predicted what was going on with generative AI, I think the point of conviction as a firm is not AI or generative AI. Like when we wrote the launch blog post, we said like, we think software development is changing dramatically because it is going to be about manipulating models for a while. I think that is still true. Right. What that implies is that the models, like, why does that matter at all economically? And for any of your listeners and people building applications, it's because the cost to deploy something that's magical and really sophisticated goes down dramatically if you're not training from scratch, and if you can be efficient about getting it to do like this super sophisticated task, right? And so I think that overall framework is pretty stable, but like and it's just very hard to decide what is like the best state of the art way to do something, because we spend a bunch of time with people who work at leading labs, and they also change their tune pretty quickly on like, one was like, you
Yeah.
should never do the retrieval, to we're doing a bunch of retrieval, right?
Yep.
In terms of how to manage like increasingly large context windows and when to use them or not. And so I think I think the prescription of like particular architectural patterns is really hard now. We just think that there's a lot of alpha for any organization in trying to stay up to date.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I probably hear the most from people that are just like heads down building. Probably the bigger the company they're at, the more that they struggle with this, which is like, we've got a dozen OKRs to hit, and we're trying to figure out, how to deliver on the thing we're already building. And then there's 6 new state of the art things that came out this week. Um, have you seen teams that are like really effective at digesting what's new and stand out on that distribution of being able to like process the new stuff coming out and make use of it? And if you have, like, what are some characteristics or techniques, like tactics? Are they doing something that you've noticed that like lets them move faster at adopting the new best practices as they emerge?
I mean, I'd like to think some of our companies are like that, right? And then I do think that those that develop the next state of the art model, the product teams there are the most likely to figure out how to do this adaptation, right? And they work very closely with research. And so I think there's like, a cascading behavior to be learned from that. I think
Yeah,
that,
yesterday, like the 4.1 model. Sorry, but you're making me think
yeah,
of like we're going to date ourselves. Whenever this podcast gets published, 4.1 got released yesterday from OpenAI, and they published this cookbook with a prompting guide that was super super tactical, and the kind of thing that was clearly only learned through a lot of reps using the system and like testing it out and figuring out new techniques and like what was really working well with the model. um, you're just making me think about that with like the applied folks being tied on the research side. But some of the things in that are just like, you know maybe could have been known by other people, but they were not written down in a nice easy to digest guide before now. And like that's a great example, right? Because those are the folks that get to spend their days figuring out how to make these things work well, versus the folks that might be like, you know trying to hit the OKR for the quarter and doing a half dozen other things. On the like applied side, right? Like I wonder what else, you've seen folks doing to just try to digest uh in like a first party way and figure out what those best practices are. Do you have any examples there?
I think it just helps to have like a very ambitious roadmap here. Yeah, I know that seems like kind of orthogonal to the idea of digestion, but um, one thing that strikes me every time I talk to people who are building product in conjunction with the research teams at the labs, or even some of our companies that have like agentic workflow products in out in the wilds like Harvey, is they just assume that they're going to be able to do like everything eventually, right? Short of be the litigator. And if you do that, you like the current set of products that you have will always fall short, like really far short. But you can take this broad set of things that you um, want to be able to do with agents and just say like, okay, at what point will how do I close that gap, and like where are capabilities allowing me in combination with a bunch of sort of new orchestration techniques and tool use going to get me closer to accomplishing that action. So I think it helps to have a very ambitious North Star. I feel for like your very accurate depiction of a team in a bigger company that is trying to ship one thing at an acceptable quality level to their end users within an existing product construct. But I think like some piece of it is, Spencer Skates at Amplitude just declared like it's AI week for his whole company. And the view is like, but we also need to think past the next step. right? And I think there's a way of building product with the assumption that like the floor is shifting beneath you. Um, I think you can take a lot of this, and you guys think about this from I don't know, like the last several decades of engineering practice, where uh, you know before you know more about the use case and before you've made if you don't have the confidence to make a bunch of very long-term decisions, you don't stick in a bunch of layers of abstraction you're unsure about, right? And
Yeah.
so, like, trying to maintain simplicity, like doing very fast prototyping, and then spending a bunch of your time understanding like the edge cases of what you're trying to do, where like the early stages of an engineering project, where you're still scoping. I feel like we're just in this sequence of continual scoping as we ship. And I think the teams that act like that do better.
I think that having ambitious roadmaps, good advice. It reminds me of what, like at OpenAI Dev Day, I can't remember if it was Sam or Kevin that said this, but one of them said something to the effect of like, you know, build something today for like what's at the edge of possible, right? Pretend that like it's not possible for the next 6 months, because it probably will be by the time you finish building it. The models are just going to evolve, right? That kind of have more ambition than what seems possible today has been consistent advice in this space. I think you also get to see like the inverse side of it. I know you spend a lot of time, talking with bigger companies, people that are trying to ramp up on AI. If that's some of the positive advice, like, do you have any examples from the negative about like failure states or cultural modes to be in that like are not going to get you there? Anything that you would like say as words of warning or advice for folks?
This is not quite that, but it is not as if every company is going to act like the foundation model labs. And I'll like make this much more real. We had a bunch of the portfolio go hang out with researchers at one of the major labs recently. And I was talking to somebody who is leading an agent effort, and their reaction to a question I had around the ability to use agents more reliably, right? Like mission critical use cases and use and customer facing use cases and like techniques for handling that, was just like, oh, like if you just needed to be more reliable than this, like don't like just you like work on less sensitive use cases. And it's a really interesting point of view, because like you can tell it's very technology up versus customer back, because as a technologist who's like, I can make anything I want with agents, I'm trying to work on AGI, he or she can just like abandon the use case they were working on because they're like, oh, we're not going to get there right now, or it's like not worth the effort right now. um in contrast, like same week, I was talking to um, the one of the technical leads for a major U.S. financial institution, where they have very clear views on the use cases
Hmm.
for automated conversation or action that have an economic impact or have an end user like experience impact, right? They're not going to decide to like go focus on other use cases. There are things they're already doing. They want to make them better. They have, ways to measure the quality of those, for example, conversations or actions or resolutions. Um, and then there's a compliance and safety bar that they're not going to compromise on. And so it's quite interesting that there is a bifurcation of just like orientation, where I think in most companies there will be a breadth of use cases that are possible, and in some ways you can act like the labs, and you hunt for the opportunity and you try to build the most powerful and sophisticated things that are not sensitive to the failure modes of these models and these products today. um, But in other ways, like the things that are important to the business are what they are, and the limitations of the business are what they are. But I think that's kind of the opportunity for any like in-house product team or external like vendor to actually think about what all of those boundaries are for the customer and like serve that use case. Oh, this particular financial institution, the technical lead said, we will never show generated outputs to an end user, like even with guardrails, right? Like we want to only show explicitly designated utterances or whatever the word would be here, phrasings, from a safety perspective, which was very surprising to me. And I think it's also just interesting how that is in stark contrast to, I think, some of the lab leaders who would just say, like, how
Got
could
to do it
that
in the real
be
world.
of yeah, of course, the customer support representative for your company will occasionally make a mistake. Like there's some quality bar we need to hit and it's not 100%. And eventually we're going to want to use generation directly. Those people will come our way and we will see what happens here.
Yeah. Do you think that that setting that that person in that financial institution had, was that like a literal compliance obligation? Was it just more of a cultural mode? Do you know?
Oh, I think it's cultural because
Yeah.
there are other financial institutions that are showing end users. I mean, because even compliance is risk,
Yep.
right? I'm reasonably sure today there's no specific regulation that says you can't show a generated output to a customer um, at a financial institution. I think there are um, certainly penalties for making certain types of
For screwing
mistakes.
up. Yeah.
Mhm.
Then that makes sense. And and I mean, this is an interesting part of your world too, because you get to talk to these enterprises as well as to the startup folks in the labs. But one of the memes I feel like that has not really gone away in the last, 18 months is that so many enterprise use cases are struggling to make it from prototype to production. Just finger in the air. I feel like people still think the majority are just stuck. Um, what's your take on why that is? Like, are there other factors going on besides cultural that are causing that to be the case?
I just think it's not intuitive. Well, I'd have two guesses. One is that it takes a lot of engineering work to make one of these solutions useful end to end in the real world,
Yep.
right? And like it's a truism, so I hate saying something like that. So it's easier when we like think about a particular example, uh, and so um, maybe we'll just use customer support because it's an easier one, right? Like or a sort of more intuitive one. You need to go integrate with like text and phone systems. You need to go integrate with CRM systems. You need to create a set of um, preferences around like what the brand voice is. You need to think about the like pathways and actions that a rep would have taken and which are translatable today. And then you need to get to an acceptable quality bar. And it's like that's an engineering project. Even if the models were perfect, they were like perfect. Even if the models were even more capable than they are today, um, there's a bunch of pure engineering work there. And so I think one thing that has happened is you have a new way of delivering these intelligence powered software products. People have to adapt to it. Then they have to decide to do it. They have to like have the capability, which is like going up the learning curve, right?
Yep.
Then they need to get something out. They need to iterate. They need to like decide that the quality is acceptable. And so it's just sustained effort. And what that does is create opportunities for platforms and products like, things like Sierra or Decagon that make it easier, right? Or deliver more of the solution. But it's still a bunch of work, in-house or out of house. So I'd say one is just like it's just not easy, even if it's valuable. Um, I think a second is that the bar keeps moving, right?
Hmm.
In like I bet when you say that things are stuck going from prototype to production, I think there are less sensitive use cases that are moving to end users in production really, really quickly, right? And so the number of companies that have some retrieval powered thing internally, like are doing an internal search product or some sort of assistive thing that is focused to internal users, is very large. I'd say if you just look at the numbers on any of the inference platforms, like people are calling the model a lot. So something is in production, right? That's not all like, in vendor testing. And so I think a part of it is like what we expect now is people are like, okay, well, doing any sort of routing and search and fan out and retrieval, that's not an agent anymore. Like an agent has to be like this big end-to-end thing that is doing its own planning and has these couple it's not a real agent unless it does X.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think that word is almost, so weirdly used today. It has no meaning. But if the question was like, are there compound systems where like multiple components of intelligence are used? I'm like, well, yes, like people are doing that. And so I think the definitions just get waved away when progress is being made so quickly that I think in a good way, the ambition makes it feel like a stretch all the time. Um, I think another piece is just like uh you need a new lens for risk, right? I'm sure you guys see this where you need to think about this stuff statistically
Yeah.
in terms of like
Versus Boolean,
yeah
yes or no
versus
answers.
it's just this is deterministically
Yep.
versus like this is what you get and
Yep.
it will work this much of the time and you have to figure out because I think if you asked product leaders or operational leaders like on a given task, if that task was not done before or done by humans before, is 80% good enough? Is 90% good enough? Is 95% good enough? Is 98% good enough if the 2% is really bad? Like, I don't think people had that mental framework before. And I think, therefore, the reaction to the question has been to probably be more conservative and in certain cases for good reason.
People are holding a higher bar for AI than they are for people. And I think this is one of the interesting things that we're hearing folks say more and more often. It's like,
What do you think the answer is? Like the getting stuck answer?
I think that a big factor here is also a product factor, right? Like, part of it's the engineering work that assumes you have a good thing to go work on and build. And then part of it, I think, some of those cases where we've gone deeper with folks that are like stuck in that prototype to production phase, it was like, well, maybe that wasn't really like the best problem to go work on in the first place or the most valuable problem to solve. Like a fair amount of like AI for innovation's sake, let's go try and build it ourselves. And I think people, where there have been good product ideas, we've also seen like a growing trend in folks saying, hey, wait a second. Like we started working on this at a time when there wasn't a clear off the shelf solution, but like take what you just said as one example, RAG chatbots or, search systems internally. Like now there's Glean and Guru and Sana and, increasingly just like Google Workspace or Microsoft's products that are doing a lot of those same jobs for you. And you don't have the same incentive to work through building it yourself that you used to. Like the SaaS version exists. The Sierras of the world are building the customer service solution instead of having to write all the code yourself and, do all that quality work and all the plumbing. So that's been a factor I think we've seen more of too, is people just saying, you know what, we're not going to do this ourselves and we're going to go buy something to solve the problem.
I also think that related to this product thinking question, people, I think we're like 1% of the way into exploring the use cases that are possible, even with like, today's models. Right. And I don't just say that to be an optimist. I just like when you think about what has to happen, and all of the ways in which you just like can do something online or in a piece of software or interact with information, which is kind of the spec today. Like that's what the field looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to have a conversation about AI with like every person I talk to in a random context, just as I'm curious, like what they've tried and what they know. And like I think people mistake most people in America have tried ChatGPT at some point for like there's any intuition for what these models can do, right? And that's actually what we need, right? There's this huge opportunity for anybody who has product instinct, and not necessarily even deep technical understanding, but any intuition for what the models can do as applied to like real life workflows, right? I work with this company, Sola, and the idea of uh, being able to interact with websites easily to collect information. Imagine like get data off a government portal
Yep.
or a health insurer portal or something programmatically
Yep.
is probably obvious to folks who have you know thought about the fact that these agents can browse from a first party perspective now, and you can build products that yeah, have tool use including different types of browsing. But if some, even if a product person, operations leader, engineer in a logistics company or the middle office of a bank has tried ChatGPT, it's not obvious that like it will occur to the people who have this problem immediately that something else is possible, right? And so I just think that the diffusion of the product thinking that will then translate into the things that are really valuable is going to take a while.
Do you see organizations that are doing that really well? I feel like I've run into this a couple of times recently, talking to C-level people. Um, ask them what some of their biggest frustrations are, pain points are when it comes to generative AI, and thinking that like I'm going to hear something back about their roadmap or about the um, thing that they want to go build in the business for their customers. And I've had like three people in a row say it's actually the people in the organization adopting these tools and thinking differently. And not to say he's one of them, but like Toby, from Shopify published his post 3 weeks ago, whatever now, along these lines, right? Where he's like, hey, this is now the norm. It's the expectation. You need to be using this stuff. But a lot of folks seem to be in that situation where they're needing to say it. They're needing to give the people permission, needing to give them tools. And like they're waiting for their teams to catch up and start using these tools like they could be used. Have you seen folks really crack that nut where it's like it's felt different? The culture has shifted and there is more creativity around how to use them.
I think this is a like an actual instance where um leadership matters, right? Where if there is, I think it's very easy for every leader to be like, we should do AI, right? But like what actually creates room for people to invest time and energy and take risk, or encourages them, even more than take room. Um, uh, it is recognition that there is learning cost, is enablement of tooling. It is recognition that there is like failures of these products. Um, it is like some sense of optimism. There's also going to be resistance in many organizations where like there's a overall question of the fear everybody jumps to is like job displacement. And one thing that is, especially in larger companies where it just feels like there's more, let's say, like potential, desire for cost cutting versus like growing in smaller companies where there wasn't that much space anyway. Um, this is interesting. Maybe as a data point for your listeners, like the key driver for adopting the products of any of our companies at Conviction today has not been headcount reduction.
Mm, right.
It is almost always like, I want to become more competitive. I want to increase my pace of business. I want to increase my market share. I want to produce something of higher quality for my end customers. I want to reach more customers. I want to improve the customer experience. I want to move on my own roadmap faster. Uh, I think that there is actually an interest in cost reduction, but it tends not to be like where that has been true. It has not been internal headcount. It's been like vendors, right? When people have like contract forces and such, or just external services providers. And so I think that is where actually people are going to see it. But the core point, I'm just recognizing the reality of that. The core point is the driver for adoption has been competitiveness and growth. And I think that's the thing that appeals to the success cases, right? Where you feel like there's gonna be a win, and that's why people in an organization will pursue it.
I know we're going to run out of time here, so I'm going to ask you one more question. It's a good one for you spend time, especially like I've seen you do this with Embed, the accelerator that you run. But for folks that are building in this space, what doesn't exist yet that needs to? What are the ideas that you'd love to see somebody go out and solve where you think there's opportunity?
So I will give you an answer because you asked, but I also think that usually when people start successful companies, like there's a reason it's them, right? And so it's not that I think that you can't give people the context to start interesting companies. And my favorite example of this is Evan and Sanjay, who started this machine learning for email security company called Abnormal, which is rapidly growing, crushing it as a company. They came from ads retargeting and then Twitter, right? And they took things that they understood. They're like, we understand like how looking at patterns of communication against user identity could be useful and possible. And I'd say like the insight that applies to email in a business relevant way is not a particularly deep insight, but it's not one they saw before they had the market context. But you give those guys 2 weeks of like a little bit of visibility into that problem, and they're like, we have a prototype, we think it's a problem, we think people will pay us, we think we can do a better product here, which is great. But there's a reason it's them still. And so I for folks that are hunting around for a problem, I would really think about like what you understand, either from a end user perspective or from like an engineering and product perspective. And you can also learn these things, right? Like people, some folks that we work with, they make themselves an expert in a particular domain. Like I think Parker Conrad at Rippling knows an awful lot about HR software now. It is not because he knew
before Zenefits,
a ton about HR software before Zenefits. He's just like kind of an obsessive guy. And if you like do that for 10 years, then like there's not a lot of people who like care about that workflow as much as you do. But it like, and I smile when I say this because I don't think everybody would want to do this, but the dude genuinely cares, right? He like really, really wants to understand the very last detail of every
you got to
edge
care about
case
the problem.
That said, like some things like feel like they're good shapes of problem for model capabilities today. And I just think that like insurance is it's an industry that has so much text processing that is incredibly inefficient, that is very large. And if you started with communications, if you started with claims processing, like I think that there's a vertical player to be built there that is very large.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to respect your time. Thank you for joining. This is a great conversation. Appreciate it. And look forward to the next time.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Sarah. All right. That's all we have for today's episode of Deployed, the AI Product Podcast. I'm Ian Cairns, CEO and co-founder of FreePlay. I hope you enjoyed listening. And if you did, we'd love to hear about it. Your reviews mean a lot. They help other listeners. So give us a like, share, subscribe, wherever you're listening to this. And if something stood out to you in the episode, or if you've got feedback or ideas for a future episode, or if you simply just want to learn more or up to at FreePlay, shoot me a note. I'm Ian at freeplay.ai. You can also find me on Twitter at Cairns. Thanks so much for listening.